Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the First World War. I am Mike B, and today we're going to be talking about stick grenades. So obviously, if you know anything about the First or probably more than likely the Second World War, you'll recognize what these are. Oops, they're fake. Sorry, they're replicas. I don't have the money or the license to own real grenades, so we're going to have to deal with these. These are fantastic replicas though, and that's why I'm confident enough to make this video using these. So, World War I, just a brief synopsis. We're going to go over the history, the use, and why they were designed this way a little bit. Going to be a very macro level video. I'll probably be doing a lot more videos, more in depth in the future, using these as visual aids. So, yeah, when the First World War broke out, basically no nation had a totally standardized hand grenade. Most European countries didn't because of the style of warfare up until that point, the line battle over long distances. Grenades weren't really a practical weapon because of the distance and the style of fighting that took place. Now, when you went from line battle in open areas to line battle in trenches and it became more stagnant and kind of not as mobile, well, grenades become a necessary weapon for both offensive and defensive purposes, which they were used for in the First World War widely. Now, all these countries had to try to figure out what was the best design and with their fragmentation versus concussion, versus offensive and defensive use. With those, all these different factors had to come in to play and actually, kind of came through in the design of the actual grenade themselves. So you got the British and the French that were using more of a defensive style hand grenade that threw a lot of fragmentation out, and they were smaller and they were round. You could carry a lot of them. They were very compact, very easy to prime and arm. But they had drawbacks as well. If you throw them in an area that's got an incline, they're going to roll down to the bottom of that, maybe becoming ineffective in your initial target area. They, so every kind of grenade had shortcomings. Now, what the Germans decided to do was they decided to be more offensive. And what would later become the stormtroopers were initially just raiding parties. They realized the need for an offensive grenade that would be more concussive than it would throw fragmentation. Because their idea was if you get a bunch of people with grenades that don't throw a lot of fragmentation, so it minimizes the risk of friendly fire, but still wounds, incapacitates, and kills with the concussive blast, and you got a bunch of those grenades thrown in the soldiers, the infantry was right behind those grenades, so within the first 30 seconds of the enemy being incapacitated, they would be right up on them and taking advantage of that situation. They came out with this, the model 1915 Stille Handgranate. And what it was a can basically filled with about 6 ounces of, I can't pronounce the explosive, but it was comparable to TNT but more stable. Explosives at that point were kind of also in the experimental phase of trying to get perfected. And what these were used for, why they put the handle on there, was for several reasons, but I'll just name a couple. The first one, obviously, you can think of, and someday I will be actually filling these up with a comparable weight, probably sand or something, but I want to get the weight correct, and showing you this advantage that these can be thrown a lot farther with a lot less effort than a smaller grenade. The spinning effect and just the balance point being, right below the canister gives this a spinning effect that can actually propel it farther distances than a heavier, smaller, more compact, more round grenade. And I will be doing a video demonstrating that, and you'll see I've done it before, but I've also broken several replicas. That's why I got a few of these, so we can do that in a future video. I'll be making a lot of videos with these. But you get more distance, right? So you can put more distance between yourself and the grenade, which was concurrent with the style of basically what became the stormtroopers, just as much carnage, as much chaos, and as much effect as quickly as possible right before an assault. And these grenades could be thrown far enough away to where the soldier could be running, it would go off, they would not get a lot of the concussive blast or fragments, and then they could be right up on the enemy within a matter of a few seconds. So that actually worked well to the advantage of being able to throw these a little bit farther. Now, another factor that I mentioned earlier in the video is that these could be thrown, and very precisely thrown, into an area that maybe wasn't perfectly flat, maybe a shell hole or a trench itself, and could land on an incline, and it would just spin like this in place and not roll down the hill, right? That's another advantage of having a stick or a handle on here versus just having, like, if you just use the cap or an egg grenade style, like or defensive grenade that was made for fragmentation. This was a really good design for being where you throw it, where it lands is where it's going to stay. So if you get people who are proficient and precise enough to throw these can land exactly where you want them to without the risk of rolling. I mean, even if you throw a Mills bomb or an F1 straight, it can still roll past or, you know, in front of where you wanted it to go. That's where this comes in handy as a design itself. There are flaws to it. This is a lot bigger design. It's a lot bulkier. There is a belt hook on here, but it still limits the amount of grenades you can actually carry. So these were either carried in bags or on the belt or, you know, hooked wherever they could carry these. And as many were carried as possible, but instead of being able to carry over a dozen, you could maybe carry a dozen maximum of these grenades because of the size of them. So that was a disadvantage. Now, the other disadvantage on the Model 1915 here was in the priming system. So the way these things work is they come disassembled, and this is the same way through the First and Second World Wars, where you've got the head with the charge in it that comes in one piece. This, which doesn't come out, actually does come out of here. Cool. So you've got the actual fuse itself, right? And then the ignition mechanism comes in the handle. So that's why it's written on here and on the later grenades, which we'll talk about in a second, vor Gebrauch Sprengkapsel einsetzen, which means before use, set the fuse or put the fuse in. So they would come disassembled like this, and then the soldiers would have to screw the fuse in right here, arm it. I mean, this obviously doesn't have a fuse, and then put the charge on there, and it would be armed and ready to go. So why they shipped it like this, it's a lot safer, and they had a lot less accidents in the shipping process. Now, where this particular design fell short, 5.5 second fuse written on there, it's approximate, is the fact that when the way they, I was just going to tell you how they work. So you see that little fuse in there. Well, there was a string that would be out of the bottom. There'd be a hollow channel in this stick, and there'd just be a string that popped out of the bottom of these first designs that the soldier would have to, you know, wrap their finger around it or whatever, try to dig it out, and pull this string, which would slide some coarse steel against another material, and it would create sparks in here, which lit the fuse at the bottom right here, and it would travel up into that copper tube that you saw, which was the actual fuse itself. It would travel up here, the fire would travel up here into the cavity where it would meet the charge and ignite it. So the shortcoming was it was very unsafe in these first models to just have a string hanging out. It can get caught on things. A lot of these went off without them being intended to go off. So in 1916, this replica doesn't have this, which is unfortunate, but they got it 99% of the way there, so I'm pretty happy with this. What happened in 1916 is they hollowed out the bottom of this handle a little bit in this ball area, and they put this porcelain ball on the string. Now, you'd think that would be a little bit better. It was safer indeed, but the problem was it was still exposed, and you had to fish the porcelain ball out on the string. You had to try to fish it out of this handle, which gave, you know, added more time to the priming phase of the grenade, which in an assault scenario, you don't really have time for. You need to arm these and prime them as fast as possible and get as many of them out as possible. Well, that was a shortcoming. So in 1917, the later refined, approximately, you know, model 1917 hand grenade came out. Now, this is the one that was going to be used through the rest of the First World War, through the 1920s and the Weimar days, by the Freikorps specifically. Loved these things because a lot of them were former stormtroopers. And these were going to be the catalyst for the design in World War II, which we'll talk about in another video because this is a World War I series. But I'll be making a video talking about the three main designs of the offensive Steel Handgranates. So this came out. It still retains the belt loop because they knew that, you know, that really it's still awkward to carry these, but they have their advantages and they were used to these. So they maintained the belt loop. The can was a little bit different. The head was a little bit different. It was a little bit thinner and longer than the previous one. And I think it was filled with the same stuff where they were trying to experiment with different explosives. So you could have a little bit smaller head, which gave you more room to maybe carry one more, two more, and a little bit lighter weight. And the fuse worked the exact same, and they were shipped the exact same. Let me get the head off of here just to show you. And so you'd have to, you know, instead of being written on the bottom here, like on the M15s, apparently not everybody got the memo. So they wrote it on the actual side right here, which was retained through the Second World War. And they've got the manufacturing company's mark right there. And then at the bottom, you'll see that they've got this cap, this metal cap on the bottom, which is not present on the model 1915, right? Or I should put it like that. So this cap was made to be a little bit easier to use, and they've got these kind of flanges on there, so if your hands are wet, if you're wearing gloves, and you don't have to fish the little porcelain ball out. So what you do is you would unscrew this cap, discard it, And then at the bottom, there was that porcelain ball that was in the 1916 version, but it was loose. It would fall out because it had the cap holding it in. So you didn't have to go in there and fish it out. You pull this string, it's armed, and you get rid of the grenade. So this is the model that was the most popular and the most well-liked by the German forces and other forces, which we'll talk about in a second, because of the fact that it was very safe and effective and a lot better, I guess, than the Model 15 and 16. These were used until stocks were depleted throughout the First World War and past the First World War. And both models were issued to not only Germany, but Germany supplied the Austro-Hungarians, the Bulgarians, and the Ottomans with these grenades, which were used by forces everywhere. You also see photos of these that were captured and used as offensive and defensive grenades by Entente forces. So these were basically used by everybody that could use them in the First World War. They're very simple to use. The arming time is a little bit longer than, say, an F1 or a Mills bomb. However, you could throw these farther. They have the advantages and all that stuff. So these were used by the Germans and other forces in both cases, both styles, offensive and defensive. They were more effective in the offensive role, as I mentioned, but in defensive roles, they weren't as effective because of the fact that they didn't have much fragmentation properties, more so were focused on concussion. So if you're throwing this at a group of advancing infantry that's spread out over a large area of ground, if they're within 5 to 10 meters, it might get them and ring their bell enough to get them to be incapacitated for a bit, but the blast really doesn't go as far as a defensive grenade style like the Mills bomb or the F1. So these, although they were used widely by Germans in the defensive scenario, situation, whatever you want to call it. Can't talk today. They were not as effective, and the Germans did come out with different styles of offensive grenades, but this was going to be the most widely used in both situations and categories by the Central Powers. So that's all I've got as far as just a macro, very level overview of the stick grenades. These things are awesome. These replicas are fantastic. I can't wait to be making a lot more videos. I will be making one where I demonstrate how to throw these and that they do go farther than their enemies' counterparts. So right now these are hollow, but yeah, these are about as authentic as you can get to, you know, not owning a real one or a demilled one. It's a fraction of the cost. And if you throw one of these and it breaks, it's not the end of the world. All right. Well, if you've got any questions, feel free to throw them down in the comments. I'll try to answer them. I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I'm just a guy that's been obsessed with military history for the past 20, 25 years and love doing it. So I also want to thank the sponsors of this video who made getting these possible. My Patreon supporters and channel members. So I can afford to fund a certain amount of content that I like to make out of pocket. Now, there's a fine line where I can afford and where I can't, and what people want and what I can actually do are two different things. Now, crowdfunding changes that and allows me to make really cool content that I didn't ever think I was going to be able to make, just funding out of pocket, because I've got people that support my work and basically are my sponsors. Because I'm not a fan of people that take corporate sponsorships just for the sake of making money if they don't 100% believe in the product that they're endorsing. So if I were to ever do something like that, it would be because I endorse the product, not just because I want those Benjamins. That's why I like to try and stay as self and crowd-funded as possible, because then it's a lot easier for me to be only accountable to myself and you, the viewers, and people who support me on Patreon, but you're supporting me by watching, so you're all, you know, I'm accountable to you guys instead of being accountable to a bunch of different companies of stuff like that. So that's kind of why I ask for if you want to support me, the best way to do that is Patreon or becoming a channel member. And if you can't support the channel financially, that's totally fine too. There are other ways to do that, like the YouTube algorithm favors is liking this video, giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, throwing a comment down in there, let what you thought of this video or a question or something. And also, the best way to support my work, non-financially, is to share this video out. If you thought this was educational, you like this series, you like any of my content, sharing the video out, getting a conversation started about historical topics like stick grenades, which is pretty popular. And that's what keeps military history and history in general alive, is conversations about it. So those are all ways you can support my work. If you don't want to support me, I have bad news for you. You already have by watching this video and making it this far. So I do appreciate everybody who watches, period. Thank you so much again for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode of the First World War.